a triumvirate of positivity.
Memory, he added in a postscript, often strikes me as a kind of dumbness. It makes one's head heavy and giddy, as if one were not looking back down at the receding perspectives of time, but rather down on the earth from a great height, from one of those towers whose tops are lost to view in the clouds.
What is certain, though, is that mental suffering is effectively without end. One may think one has reached the very limit, but there are always more torments to come.
Looking at those gashed bodies, and at the witness of the execution doubled up by grief like snapped reeds, I gradually understood that beyond a certain point, pain blots out the one thing that is essential to its being experienced, consciousness, and so perhaps extinguishes itself. We know very little about this. What is certain, though... Oh, you just read this. Oh, I just realized I just was reading the same quote David just read.
There's your intro! Nathan, what's this book about?
The Emigrants is a work of semi-fiction, creative nonfiction. We'll probably get into this, covering 4 lives in 4 sections, each of whom are German emigrants who have left Germany for England or Switzerland or other places. And the author or the narrator recounts their lives, retraces their steps, and illuminates a little bit about their inner lives and the pain that they carried with them in their emigration out of Germany. Their names, we'll probably get into each of these a little bit more detail, but their names were Dr. Henry Selwyn, Paul Beriter, Ambrose Adelwarth, and Max Ferber.
Is Selwyn's Lithuanian, though?
Was he Lithuanian German, or was he just Lithuanian?
I thought he was Lithuanian.
He didn't go through Germany?
We shouldn't focus on these details whatsoever.
I think something that's... Well, there's a lot that's interesting about the book to me, but one of the things that is kind of paramount is that these people are real people.
Are they?
At least I think that they are.
They're not real people. So sets up our first point of discussion.
Okay. What is a real person once they're written down? Another thing, once you pick up this book is that it's sprinkled with photographs that ostensibly illustrate the text. And I think much has been made over the use of photographs and their illustrative quality and their implication that they are real, or the dimensionality that they seem to give to the written text. Mm-hmm. The narrator in this is explicitly Sebald, right? I think in Rings of Saturn it wasn't explicit, or did I just start to assume that after Rings of Saturn?
I think it makes you assume it, but I think it's not Sebald. Just in the same way that these photos are all just found artifacts that are used to string along a story and give the perceived connection.
That's not actually true.
Okay.
At least according to Sebald, that's not true. He said that 90% of these photographs are literally what is written about.
Yeah.
Interesting, because I've read like an Austerlitz and things like that where those photos are just like the photo on the front of Austerlitz is not the child, just a found image.
I think some of them are, but Nathan, you're referring to that interview from with I think it's
Brick?
James Woods, maybe.
I don't remember.
But yeah, he says that like most of the photographs are real.
Well,
and the
like
ones
the things.
Well, the ones that aren't were like the postcards or the ephemera that still reference the thing being written about, but weren't actually from the people and their photo albums.
I guess that's what I'm looking to like define real here. Like, if you take any of these narratives and you have, multiple pictures throughout, this person's life that goes from as a child to as a teenager, as an adult, as an old person. Are you saying that in those that they actually track the real theoretical basis for the story? Or are you saying that these are representative of the era and are real photos but have differences in the actual individuals?
think the former. They're not simply representative of a time period. They are literally the photographs of those people.
Interesting.
Whose names may be changed. So for the listener, I feel like this is my fault, getting off into a technicality of it. Maybe we should come back to this in the text, but do you want to flesh out some of these characters that he so delicately draws?
I'm sorry, this is funny. I just got to step outside this recording because this is the exact opposite of everything I've read about this book. And I honestly don't know what's true anymore. But this
is exact.
But like everything about Sebald I've read is that like he literally like finds this stuff and strings stories together based on this. And yes, they're rooted in history, and his narratives aren't made up. They're not fantastical. But like the images that you're looking at is not the person who's referred to.
And this is my beef with the way that Sebald is talked about, is that a lot is made of the distance between the fiction and the nonfiction. And to me, he really is towing the line of nonfiction. It has been presented for one reason or another as fiction, as revolutionary fiction, when to me it's like baking a cake and selling it as a pie. It seems like good nonfiction, and he fills in some of the details. And I could be wrong, but that's what he said himself about this book, that these are real people, that these are real pictures of these real people. And furthermore, like, so the Max Ferber section is about this artist in Manchester, this painter. In the German edition, this character was named Max Auerbach or something like that, which is much closer to the name of the painter in London who it's based on. And there was actually, I believe, one of his paintings in the original German and a photograph of him in the original German that the painter asked to have removed because he wasn't comfortable with how closely it represented him in his story.
Nick, some context. So this is from that interview with Wood. And he said, the question is one that I'm asked frequently about, what is real in terms of photographs. He says, a very large percentage of those photographs are what you would describe as authentic, i.e. they really did come out of the photo albums of the people described in those texts and are a direct testimony of the fact that these people did exist in that particular shape and form. A small number, I imagine it must be in the region of 10%, are pictures, photographs, postcards, travel documents, that kind of thing, which I had used from other sources. They are, I think, to a very large extent, documentary.
Well, I've been completely wrong the whole time.
It could be just about this book in particular, though, because they are talking about the Emigrants. Okay. Maybe in Austerlitz, which I have not read.
Maybe he
most
leans
of those
into
are
that more.
Found objects.
Yeah. Well,
but this is a puzzling thing about this book because, and I found about Rings of Saturn too, because there is the conceit that this is fiction, but by all appearances, it's not. So, and I think that he kind of enjoyed, it would seem, playing that up. And that interview that David just quoted is very interesting because he talks about how uncomfortable he is with the idea of the author, an author of fiction has control, and he didn't want control. So he places in the text all sorts of limits of his control over what he knows, what he can control, which is interesting because doesn't the idea of fiction require an author who has control? And if you cede that control, is it no longer fiction?
I mean, you're kind of asking the old autofiction question that everybody loves talking about these days.
I still don't know what that is.
Basically this. It's this.
It's just fiction that's heavily autobiographical.
Yeah. And I think like
so it's like Instagram.
You're sort of inverting. We read all this fiction and we look for the author in it and we go, oh, if I can figure out if this is a real thing that happened to the author, then that's interesting to me. And people get mad about that, right? And they say, no, it needs to be divorced. It's not. It's fiction. And this is like very nonfiction oriented. And people are getting into Sebald because they like the idea that it's nonfiction that sort of can be read as fiction. So you're sort of inverting that. And that's where that sort of, are these photos real? Are they not real? Are these narratives real? Are they not real? That's where that starts to, I think, pique people's interest, right? But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. all of this stuff is just like, it's all through a human. It's all distorted by memory. It's all, a narrative. Is it a narrative that you like? Does it have themes that you like? Does it make you feel something? I think that's like the end thing. This whole like line between fiction, nonfiction, autofiction. I don't know. It's just shit people make up to put on book covers.
I don't know. I don't know that I agree with that. I mean, I think that it is a sort of continuum. There's inherently an author who puts the words down. But I think knowing that there were real human beings who suffered in this way is kind of integral to the piece. Yeah, I guess to get into the text a little bit more, each of these four experienced a tremendous amount of suffering, largely related to the Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and that suffering catches up with them towards the end of their life, and three of these characters commit suicide. And knowing that there was really an elementary school teacher loved by his students who placed his body on a railroad track adds a certain gravity to this that I don't think would be there, or that gravity would have to be created in a different way if this was truly fiction.
I tend to agree with you, Nathan. Knowing, or at least in my case, kind of assuming that these are real people or more or less real people. How do I phrase this? Something could be entirely fictional, but based on reality. It could be realistic fiction. And yet, I think Sebald, because of the use of images, and in addition to those, his actual writing style is not very fictional. Like, it doesn't move the way a novel normally moves, or the actual text and writing, the sentence structure, everything about it feels very much like reporting, or someone like digging into the past. We don't really slip into characters. There's not really scenes. There's a level of detachment to it that lends it an air of reportage.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in doing that, gives it additional weight. Whereas like a fictional narrative would sort of remove you from that weight.
Right, but I guess I don't see a difference either way. If you can be emotionally moved by something, does it matter if it's real or not?
Well, I think, at least for me, having that connection to reality helps me feel moved.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that I think it's actually disconnected from it, meaning that like my experiences, sometimes the most moving things actually aren't connected to reality. It's all in how it's delivered, which in this book is fantastically, right? So basically what I'm saying is I've been thinking about this book as this kind of like, I would say lightly fabricated, right? I always assumed it was based on narratives, right? That had some tie to reality. But my assumption for most of Sebald has been that he's telling an important story that needs to be told. And it does have a direct tie to these individuals' lives. But it might be an amalgamation of multiple things, right? He might be tying things together, and he's sort of using that as a way of producing something cohesive. And he's less concerned, or rather, that structure is less concerned with if it's 100% authentic, because the important part is the narrative. And so what I'm saying is that to me is the end point, that knowing whether or not it's entirely one person's life arc, or if he basically sort of combined two people such that it's tied to reality but not really true, right? Which, quite honestly, is the basis for a lot of fiction, right? We're getting into sort of that gray area. But I'm saying I think that doesn't personally impact me. Whether or not, like, I get to the end of a book, do I have to look it up and decide whether or not it's real or not to know if the things that while I was reading made me feel something? And I think for me, the personal answer is no.
I think that's totally fair. I think I get hung up, and I'm trying to like look past this on all the superlatives about his writing and the sort of like breakthrough fiction that he's creating, when in my mind, this is very good creative nonfiction.
Full stop? I mean, what?
kind of full stop. I mean, I think this seemed especially true of Rings of Saturn. Like the creativity of weaving all this stuff together is one thing, but it's information, in a way that he's weaving together, not fiction. And it's, I mean, some of it's so academic, and this as well. It's so academic. It feels so smart. It's I'm sure there's a lot of it that's just going right over my head. And maybe that fiction is occurring at that level that's going over my head, but it certainly feels like reading nonfiction.
I think with like a Rings of Saturn thing, I've heard that people have plotted out the walk that he took, and the walk doesn't exist, right? And that's probably the layer of reality versus not reality that I think gets baked into these conversations. Is like, obviously when he's recapping, 18th century philosophers and stuff like that, that doesn't feel like a fictional thing. That just seems like information. But then the concept that, is this a real person? Is it him? Is it not him? Are these real places? Yes, but are they connected in these ways? I think that's where like the layer of fiction versus nonfiction comes in. But ultimately, I think like, it's funny, I kind of got knocked off my seat a little bit at the beginning, because I was like, this is another one that's not really real, that's kind of real. And you're telling me that's real, so I guess I'll believe you. But I think it doesn't matter. Who cares if somebody says that it's fantastic because it's fiction that reads like nonfiction? Or
well, I don't know. I guess I think that we have to care because if and maybe not in this case, because you read a novel in order to feel something, not to know something. But I'm going to walk away with things that I think that I know about history because of the way that this is presented. And if that's completely fabricated, then I should feel confident that's fabricated. Like, with War and Peace, it's based on a historical event. But I'm under no pretense that Prince Andrei is a real person who experienced real things. He's representative. And in the same book, I'm under the impression that, General Kutuzov was a real person that this is based on. And that helps me navigate my knowledge and my feelings about the world and reality. To blur that to a degree, to say like, this looks and this feels exactly and is presented exactly like a news broadcast in order to make you feel that it is a news broadcast. But it's not. But part of it is, to me, like, you don't watch the news in order to, I think you ought not to watch the news in order to feel something, right? That's just entertainment. So it's not nothing to blur the line between what is known and knowable and what is felt and feelable.
Wait, the news is entertainment, or it's not entertainment?
I mean, the news is presented as entertainment. That's not my point.
Complete entertainment.
But to know that something is happening, something happens. Things happen. There was a police raid across my street. That happened. If that shows up on the news, I care because I want to know something. That's not entertainment.
But this book is not responsible for delivering facts to you. There are history books for delivering facts.
And yet, that is mostly what it does.
Yeah.
Does it? I mean...
Yes. It's written as like a historical piece of fiction. Because again, there's no real narrative structure. It's more like, here's some things that happen in these people's lives. Here's a quick summary of this one character. So like his uncle, Ambrose, you don't really get into the character at all. It's how do people perceive him? How was he perceived? And it's just these events that happen without real strong narrative arc or anything like that. It's presented as a retelling of somebody's life.
I mean, I would argue that like this is an excellent follow-up to Heinrich Boll's group portrait with Lady, which is basically this like selection of accounts about this individual, and it's almost written as like technical documentation that was like uncovered, right? And like I think it's almost unfair to say that there's no narrative based on, just all of the observations, right? I mean, we get a lot of information. It's just from the outside. Like our narrative's completely required to do interiority. I think a lot of times interiority is present in fiction, but it's not mandatory, right? There's plenty of like outside observer style fiction.
Oh, no, I agree. But there are narratives to these, and they're hidden in a way that requires the reader to find them through what seems like a lot of mundane observances of just endless hotel descriptions, random streets, a constant onslaught of city names or historical landmarks. It's this weird, and don't get me wrong, I sound like I don't like this book. I actually really like it, but it's obfuscated by reality, the fiction.
Yeah.
Which I think is cool and interesting. And I agree with kind of both of you. At the end of the day, I still think it's a great piece of literature, but I don't know if I would call this a novel or a work of fiction necessarily. And I don't know if that matters.
That's
though.
my point.
I
don't think it matters.
Can I play my own devil's advocate for a second? And this
Yeah.
is kind of a question for David as a true student of literature. The experience reading this and feeling, as I do, a bit confused and a bit... I'm actually a little bit reluctant because of this blurring. I'm reluctant to engage fully with the book because of this blurring of fact and fiction. I don't know how to feel about these characters because I don't want to be taken in by it. Because he's using, I think, if we were to consider this fiction, he's using the method of truth-telling to implant an idea into my head, to implant a
What's
feeling.
the idea, though?
This feeling of mourning and melancholy, that he's using, that the world is truly melancholy. He's using language that I accept, that feels like a true telling to me. This doesn't feel like fiction. It doesn't feel like a tale. We read Siddhartha a little while ago, and that feels like a fable. There's no part of that feels like reality. It has the language of fable.
Mm-hmm.
So I take that as fable. This has the language, like you were saying, of reportage. And so it's traveling those pathways into my mind that are normally trafficked with what I would consider learning, factual, as best as it can be, learning, to deliver a fictional account. And is he doing something in doing that? If we were to, let's just say that these are totally fictional accounts, they're not based on anybody, it's totally fictional, and he uses this method and this blurring to get inside of my mind, would that have been, or could that have been, what an early novel felt like to somebody who did not understand and was not accustomed to being confronted with fiction?
Yeah, no, that's totally right. That's absolutely right. Like the earliest pieces of fiction confused a lot of people. Just like classic, what's the H.G. Wells? Like
War of the Worlds on the radio, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like people didn't know what to do with this format, and it kind of basically bamboozled them, is what I think you're saying, is that you were worried that you were being bamboozled while reading this for developing a connection to it being real and then understanding that it wasn't real.
How could this thing make me feel empathy?
Yeah. I only need facts. I mean, I think the most powerful thing, this is great because whether or not we're off in the weeds, this is the only thing I want to talk about with this book. But what it does do, it delivers a micro history. And I think that's the most important aspect. And whether or not that's based entirely on reality or it's lightly modified or it's completely made up, it reminds us that in this historical period, these were real people who suffered intensely. And the aftershocks of that created additional suffering, additional pain until it blotted out everything, right? And there was nothing left, only consciousness. And then that got blotted out. And I think that's the most powerful message, right? And whether or not I was bamboozled, which apparently I was, into thinking this is entirely fiction, like that's something I walk around being like, yeah, wow, the world is pretty melancholy. He is right. And so I guess that's my whole thing, is if that's what you're left with, that's the whole point.
And what Sebald does well with this blurring the lines with fact and fiction and history, and something which he reminds the reader of constantly, as in Nick's opening quote, he makes reference almost in every section, and then also in Rings of Saturn constantly, to the idea that memory doesn't work the way you want it to work.
Mm-hmm.
Especially historical memory. The specific facts about location and dates and times aren't essential to what the narrative ultimately is trying to do to you. And in a way, his blurring this realm of fiction and non is similar to what the memory does and what history does over time.
Mm-hmm.
There is no one history. It's impossible. Mm-hmm. It doesn't exist. So I see where you're coming from, Nathan, because I too find the praise to be a little over-laudatory, and yet I still appreciate and like it quite a bit because of the craft behind it and the way it leaves me feeling. Even though it's sad and melancholic, it's still human and beautiful. And there's this something heroic about the Sebaldian narrator who's like just wading through all of this stuff to record it and put it down, and knowing that it will probably end up as nothing or as a memory. It's very quixotic in a way, but I like it.
Yeah, I mean, his way to actually talk about the first specific detail of the book, his way of capturing basically the letters from Ferber's mother, right, towards the end, where he basically, like, before you sort of realized it, you were sort of inside this just recap of a woman's life from a totally different era as she is remembering it and putting it down on paper, as she knows that she's not going to make it out of Nazi Germany. And there are parts of it that are beautiful. There's parts of it that are very sad. She makes a comment in it about, and that's the point at which I knew like my life would take a negative turn, or that childhood was over, right? And that sort of arc, I think, is important because, again, whether or not that's completely made up or not, Sebald basically figured out a way to give that person life, right? And that was one of the most powerful parts of the book, I think, reading through that and hearing these specific details and knowing that this person was writing it when they knew that death was imminent, and basically establishing their own history for their son.
In the face of oblivion, recounting things that kind of seem, at least in part, prosaic and daily and boring, almost. I
think it lulls you into sleep a little bit because there were parts of it that were pretty boring, like recapping chores and neighbors and stuff like this. And then when you remember what the emotional, toil that's going on in this person's head while they're putting that down, you realize how impactful even your daily mundane things are, because they existed. And I think that idea, again, is to me so much bigger than the question of whether or not Ferber's mother really lived that life, or if it was another person in the same era, same area geographically, that those details mapped very well to this narrative. Either way, I was like almost crying reading that. And I think that is just like, that's the power of this. And I think when we talk about facts or not facts and reportage versus not reportage, a lot of times we're talking about larger events, larger narratives, larger things. And I think reportage on small events and small narratives is something that's oddly touching to the individual, because it makes you realize that all of your bullshit that you're doing every day actually did happen and actually did exist and did matter in some way. And
it has the emotional resonance of a found home recording.
Yes. That's a perfect illusion.
And I imagine, Nick, you kind of alluded to it, but for me, in this book and in Rings of Saturn, reading Sebald triggers my own memory in really unique ways. And I just kind of I'll stop reading and just get lost in a thought and travel down a memory hole for a while.
Yeah.
Or think about a relative that I met once when I was a kid. I'm like, what the fuck was their life like? Or, wherever it goes, he has a way of doing that. And I think it's really something.
And so he comments, and so they are ever returning to us, the dead. At times they come back from the ice more than 7 decades later and are found at the edge of the moraine, a few polished bones and a pair of hobnailed boots. I think that's kind of his point, is that, like you said, memory doesn't work the way you want it to, or you expect it to, but that he's also writing in a way that lends itself towards this excavation of memory. And I think that, for lack of a better term, aesthetic or vibe or mood is something that creates connections with yourself. And I think regardless of whether you're connected to this historical period or not, we've all gone through some level of pain. We've all gone through things that we can identify with these emotions. And that, I think, that's really the gist of it, I think. Yes, there's historical facts in it that really made me consider things and comprehend just smaller details of a larger historical narrative that I was familiar with. But I think like forcing you or allowing you as a reader to get into that and transfer that to your own life and your own memory, that's kind of the magic of it.
I think there's like to follow on what you're saying, Nick, there's a quality it seemed to exist with the Sebald the man, but comes across in the writing as like just caring so much about these people and the details of their lives. It's like he wants to show how important it is. Routes that they traced in their lives, especially these people who ended their lives in a state of hopelessness. And I think that does, like, you know, even these banal things that make up our daily existence, that there's something vital to it.
Yeah, he gives it a sort of, I don't know, an officialness. Man, I can't think of the word.
Yeah, it's like he's setting down, putting it in the record. These people existed, this life happened, even if, like we started the episode, maybe it's not entirely true. But it doesn't matter because someone like this existed. This kind of life happened, and these specific details hardly matter when it's about the accumulation of these things in a life and what makes a life, any life, I guess, worth remembering.
Yeah. Wait, does that mean I've converted you? You're okay that it is fiction or not nonfiction or non-nonfiction?
I just don't like the conceit.
What's the
it's
conceit?
Like,
I guess I don't know about
It's such a modern
this.
art conceit. It's like somebody takes a photograph and they call it a painting and they get displayed in the Tate. It's like you took a bad photograph. It's not a painting.
But who are you talking to? Are you just like getting influenced by people's
Just
reviews
talking
and
to
stuff, and you're
art
contrarian
critics.
to you're reading art criticisms of Sebald where you're just fuming, being like, "Ah!" Is that what you did this week?
You know, like blurring categories so that you can be unique. It's like I made a sculpture, but it's a painting. I made a painting, but it's a sculpture. So that now I am the only one who does that, versus just letting it be what it is and let it being labeled what is intuitive and what people understand it to be, which is probably closer to reality.
This is like the guy that just made the invisible sculpture, and then another guy is like, no, I made the invisible sculpture first, and he was suing him.
Did that actually happen?
Of course. Everything's real.
Except for the sculpture.
Does it matter? Does it even matter?
Yeah.
So what's up with Nabokov, the butterfly man, showing up throughout this book? It is. I mean, it's
Nabokov.
literally Nabokov. It's like there's a photograph.
It's death, man. The butterfly net is a scythe.
Why?
What do you mean, why?
I mean, did I just totally miss an obvious symbol here?
Other than Nabokov, which was the first thing I thought of, because it talks about it. The two characters that see the butterfly man in two totally separate, unbelievable situations are very much reminiscent of death appearing in classic literature. His uncle, who sees him at the sanatorium or whatever, there's like that final scene of him at the window, like the day before he died, I believe, is waiting for the butterfly man to appear. And he mentioned it to his cousin or whoever it was, the aunt that was talking to the narrator. And then I think it was Max Ferber who was up on the mountain looking down. There's a lot of characters looking down on things as well in this book. But he's looking down and he's considering suicide in that moment. He's thinking about jumping off. And then the butterfly man appears and says something along the lines of like, oh, it's about time you head back down or something. Something like very cryptic line. And it just made me think of death.
Yeah, I think there's that plus the sort of the recurring motif of, you know, like you said, looking down on things, being up in the mountains and sort of getting that high view, but then having to come back, which very much feels like taking stock of one's life, essentially. Like the classic, like as you're departing this world, or as you are on the edge of it, you know, you get to sort of view it from above. But Nathan, you just thought it was Nabokov.
I didn't know what to make of it, to be perfectly honest. And maybe I got so seduced by the non-fictionality of this that it didn't occur to me that there was a very obvious symbol right in front of my face.
I mean, I feel like one thing about this that's so cool is there are these connected aspects. There's these connected aesthetics and symbols, or whether or not they're symbols, are certainly connected events. And nonfiction doesn't cleanly line up like that, right?
It does if you're a nonfiction
Real life's...
author.
If you're selectively
creative.
creating, yes. If it's creative nonfiction, I see.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's what they're teaching in the MFAs these days. Yeah, that also introduces to me sort of a flag of like, yes, there's some liberties being taken here. Because obviously you're highlighting that, right? So if those were all factually relevant, yes, maybe there was a consistent butterfly man between all of these things. But maybe it was kind of inserted to tie these narratives together such that they feel cohesive and like part of a single narrative, albeit covered by 4 individuals.
So is the narrative arc our butterfly man who kind of appears through time and space, revealing something, learning something?
Yes.
I don't
sure,
think
we'll go with
that's
that.
True.
That's the symbol. The narrative structure is the symbol itself.
No, I think like everything else in Sebald, it's just another small detail that can reveal something. Other than like the light motifs and the recurrence of certain objects, it's just, it's more just a sense and a feeling that runs through everything. Not necessarily there's like one story being told or something through the 4 narratives.
Yeah, it's like even the motifs he holds very lightly, as if those are also outside of his control. Like the first character, I think, is also, there's no butterfly man in the first story. It's Selwyn himself, I think, is the butterfly catcher, the butterfly hunter. I think he's likes catching butterflies.
He's a lapadolid. What is it called?
I know the word you're reaching for, but I'm not going to give it an attempt.
Because there is actually a photograph of Nabokov with a butterfly net on page 16. But right before
in a magazine he just happened to be reading at the time.
Just the day before. But right before that, Dr. Selwyn in knee-length shorts with a shoulder bag and butterfly net. Like life, and he mentions this explicitly, I think, in Rings of Saturn, where there's this coincidence, and he wants to believe that there's significance beyond coincidence, but he doesn't quite even go there, I think, as an author. And maybe like the inclusion of the coincidence of the butterfly catcher leads you to want to apply meaning to that, but he doesn't. Maybe he provides enough ambiguity in that it's not even clear what if that is a symbol or if that's one of life's coincidences that we try to navigate and give reason to things.
Yeah, I think him writing that line is actually where some of those, laudatory compliments and quotes come in, right? Because, we talk a ton about how you need to leave room for the reader to make connections and to, interpret stuff for it to be good art. If you're just saying this is what it is, it can be fun, it can be nice, it can be Steinbeck or Siddhartha, quite frankly, getting similar like philosophical like fable vibes from both. But it doesn't leave you with a feeling that, you're responsible for making those connections. And I think that's a trick that if you get good at it as a writer, it creates this engaging response from the reader. And I think he was great at that because the idea of a coincidence is simply that the connection between two things seems unlikely, but given the statistical capability of it. But in reality, coincidences can happen constantly. It's random. It's whether or not we decide that this is worthy of that type of characterization, right? And we do that by filtering out a bunch of the other stuff. And so I think even if these are true narratives, he's basically filtered out enough to get it to that line to where we can have that conversation about interpretation of whether or not these are coincidences or not coincidences, whether or not these are recurring motifs or not, right? But he's very clearly, he's brought it to that level to where at least that's up for grabs. Versus if it was just truly like information, then it would be like reality. And reality, there's no coincidences. It's just a shitload of stuff happening. And that, I think, is great. I think that elicits a lot of this response that you hear about of people liking this book. It's because it takes you places and it gives you the ability to process that.
It's interesting how he does that with there still being a first-person narrator throughout the book. Because, Nathan, you mentioned how Sebald wants to sort of remove the author. He also removes the narrator from really being anyone. He provides almost no analysis whatsoever. He doesn't comment upon seeming insane coincidences. He's just there to sort of guide you as a reader. You are him sort of discovering these things along the way. Because I was thinking about that when you were talking about the idea of like coincidence and why wouldn't the narrator mention it? But again, it doesn't seem to be his sort of purview, I guess. I don't know what function he serves other as a sort of stand-in for the reader. Because there's very little character.
But he gives enough to where it's believable too, right? He sets up that, in the first narrative, he's renting somewhere to live. And in Ferber's narrative, he's arriving as a student in Manchester in a certain era. And even goes to talk about, the landlady where he lives and that weird sort of tea clock machine. Remember that thing? Which is enough, again, to like put credibility onto it. It gives you no view of who this individual is.
Other than he has just an insane amount of free time to travel wherever the hell he wants and stay in hotels for years at a time.
Basically. It was the 90s. It was before technology existed, right? He's got it all.
Was there one of these narratives that resonated with you personally more than the others?
Question. It's funny because I almost wanted to be on the flip side of David's comment about there not being like a common narrative of these. Because to me, the narratives do feel very common in that they're all about people who have been through these traumatic experiences in their family and have basically chosen to leave it, but they find that they can't actually get beyond that experience. That pain, that melancholy, the ripples of that will follow them. The majority of them end up taking their own lives or submitting to death or ushering it in quickly. And I think that to me does feel like a common theme. And I feel like I don't differentiate between them anymore, right? They fit into a similar arc for me. So it's hard to say whether one versus the other, because I feel like that would be based on the details that to me are this sort of historical, factual kind of thing. And so the arc to me just feels not familiar because I've never been through that type of thing in my life, but it feels very identifiable or easy to connect to because it feels real.
I would say I kind of agree with you. Looking back on the book, they kind of blend together in some ways, mostly in that I've forgotten so many of the small details around each narrative, and I'm just left with this impression in my mind of each character, usually of them alone in pain, which is depressing. I don't know. The one that I think of more than the others that kind of trigger something is probably the uncle, Ambrose
Adelworth.
Mm-hmm. The first one is because it's so short and I've read it so long ago, I don't really remember. It's just this man who has more or less become a hermit in the garden of this once large estate and whose wife has sort of abandoned him. But I don't remember much of his story, to be honest.
I don't think he tells a lot of that story, especially the details like he does later. Like the first one, and this is before I realized the theme of suicide was going to repeat itself. His suicide was like, there was no indication as I was reading that he was carrying this trauma. I don't think Sebald gets into that until after the suicide, because in spite of his isolation, I think he had a garden that he tended. He seemed to be functioning. He seemed to enjoy his solitude. And then out of nowhere, he ends his life with this rifle that he's never fired that he got in World War II or something. There's an interesting about that first one. I think this was from that same interview that we've referenced. He mentions that one of the reasons for its shortness was that he didn't feel comfortable prying into this person's life after their sudden
yes,
death.
I remember that.
That he wasn't close enough, I guess, to the situation, and so he didn't want to learn it. He wanted to be respectful of their privacy around that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Or maybe his interviews are fiction too. I mean, that's something I haven't considered.
Yeah, he could be totally lying.
It's an unreliable. No, the books are nonfiction, but him as an individual, as an
That's
author,
the real
is entirely
intention.
fiction.
He's actually still
That
alive,
would be somebody.
publishing under a different name.
For me, I think we've talked about this, and this isn't really the section, but the memoir from Ferber's mother, that's kind of the culmination of these narratives, I think, is like kind of the moment leading up to what is that traumatic experience. It's the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, and that's what's haunting all these people. And even though that's never explicitly I don't think it's ever explicitly talked about in the book. It's kind of the specter in all of these stories. Am I wrong? Does he explicitly in any of the narratives talk about the Holocaust?
He references it, but he never goes beyond a kind of comment or two. I think that's also by design, right? Is to, it's almost like removing it from being the main event in the book.
But yeah, he'll drop hints along the way. Like early on when he was talking about, I think it was the teacher or Paul, or I don't remember who it was, but you see these just references throughout. But it's never the focal point. It's always in the background, the event that is sort of triggering these other events where people have to move or they can't hold a job or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's actually another interesting thing, and maybe it's the Holocaust is such a loaded historical event with so much already built into that for many of us that it overpowers all these other things, all these other ways that what was happening in Nazi Germany was affecting the lives of people, and especially the Jewish people. And I think he does really bring that to life, and especially in the memoir of Ferber's mother. There's specific pieces of the other narratives that like stick with me, but I feel like that's the one that kind of becomes real for me.
Anywhere else to take this?
This was less quotable, I guess. Like I more marked like ideas, but like the writing itself, like it's good, but there's nothing that really stuck with me outside of a few passages. Whereas I felt like Rings of Saturn, there was a lot more in it. Maybe because it was more explicitly talking about its ideas. And this feels, like we talked about, more removed as a narrative.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I realized that too when I have so few things marked. I mean, oftentimes like the last sentence of each narrative is pretty on point. But yeah, it's the combination of he's not directly telling you, but he's also, I don't know, it's not, you hear about Sebald's writing in the native German, and it's supposed to be kind of eloquent and of an older style and have this kind of weight to it. And so part of me wonders to what degree that has transferred to the English translation that we're reading. But also I think part of it is that he's showing that you can deliver these ideas and these emotions without really leaning into, I don't know, flowery prose, or oftentimes when we get on a podcast and we're just ripping off or reeling off a bunch of quotes, it's because we love the book. But like here, there's almost no quotes, and yet it's still so impactful. And I feel like he kind of figured a way around that. Because most of the time when we talk about fiction, it's because, oh man, look at this line. Oh, they really nailed it, right? And I feel like this is a weird inversion of that.
Which again lends it to this idea of nonfiction feeling.
Yeah.
But also back to your initial point was that it really is a book that leaves you feeling and thinking something. And that should be what is important with a piece of literature.
So you came around? So you're on my side now?
I mean, I was kind of always there.
I definitely enjoyed and prefer this book to Rings of Saturn in the reading of it. In retrospect and talking about it, I think I actually maybe prefer Rings of Saturn.
Oh, I prefer Rings of Saturn, definitely.
But I was planning to read Vertigo, but I think I will hold off and read something else.
Give it some space.
Yeah, I like it, but like in a 3 out of 5 kind of way.
You're just saying that because you're trying to be contrarian versus the internet, who just likes Rings of Saturn more anyway. So you're just agreeing with them.
For the purposes of the podcast, but also I'm curious, just generally, like how would you recommend this to somebody, or who would you recommend this to? Like.
Oh, that's great because I feel like I've tried to do this before, and I've pretty much just described as a lot of Sebald books are sort of a narrator walking around, observing things and thinking about things, and tying them together in a loose way, but it's up to you. And as soon as I get to the end of that description with people, I can like see this glazed over look on their face. Just like, wait, you want me to read about a guy just walking around? I'm like, no, you'll like it. So basically those have been my attempts, which I'm pretty sure I told you.
I think that's exactly what you told me.
Obviously didn't work.
I remember, I think we were having a burrito. I remember that moment.
This is turning very Sebaldian.
Yeah.
What corner was the burrito shop on? Time of day?
Exactly.
What did the sun look like? And did eating the burrito remind you of anyone in your family who experienced some tragedy?
That's the posthumous Sebald book that we're all been waiting for right there.
David?
Oh, well, I don't really recommend books to people. So it seems to be a waste of time mostly. There's nothing you could do. It's like trying to summarize this book. How do you recommend it? Do you like feeling melancholy and reminiscing a lot? Jump on in. Or how do you feel about sitting and listening to an old man's stories?
Yes.
That make you feel kind of sad? Then you'll like this book.
That's exactly what it feels like to me, actually. Like sometimes it resonates and sometimes I'm like, is this just is this
just
going
get to the
somewhere?
fucking point, old man. Yeah.
But you feel kind of like you want to hold space for this person who's had a life and needs somebody to listen to their stories.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you feel good to listen.
Someday the youth will give you space.
I doubt it. Not until I get on TikTok.
Thanks for listening. As always, you can find us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handle booksosubstance. Lithuania to Germany to England. Maybe his parents were Lithuanian, thus he was Lithuanian German. Then he moved to England. This is great content. Everything's good about this.
This is good content. So anyway, read the book and find out for yourselves.
Whoa.